She was young and beautiful, with the world at her fingertips.
She was one of those ones that people just draw to her.
Loved people, caring, sharing, would give her very last to anyone. She was quite a girl.
He was the easygoing star of the football team, who swept her off her feet.
This always was Mondre, oh Mondre.
Together, their chemistry could light up a stadium.
That attraction lasted from middle school to high school to after graduation. It was always them. I've never seen her so attracted to anyone else.
But just as their relationship made the transition from puppy love to full-blown romance, a mysterious disappearance rocked their world.
A lot of people in the neighborhood were concerned.
I was praying to God to help me.
The search for the truth will expose a secret so powerful and so heartbreaking, it will leave one family desperate for justice.
It was like something you see in a drama movie. You don't expect for these things to happen to you or to happen in your family.
Friday, September 12, 2008. It's a warm autumn evening in Shreveport, Louisiana, when James and Glenda Watson make their way to a local fishing hole off LaGuardia Road.
Let's try this spot right up here.
Okay.
Only the locals knew about it. I mean, if you did not know about this place, you would never find it.
This should be a good spot.
Oh, I think so.
They were out fishing, and he and his companion noticed something floating in the water.
What's that over under the tree?
Oh, I'm not sure.
We'll go check it out.
They were some ways off, so he went over to check.
That looks like a body.
They realized that it's a body.
The water had been snake infested, the body was ravaged and bloated, and in fact, skin was starting to come off the body.
They immediately leave the area and call the police.
As authorities race to the scene, little do they know that this investigation is about to collide with another case that's boiling over with passion, shrouded in secrets, with a beautiful co-ed at its heart. Born January 22nd, 1990, Tavia Sills was beloved by friends and family alike.
She's the third of my children of siblings, 1 boy and 3 girls, and she's between the 2 girls. Tavia was fun and funny growing up. She had her little things that she did that, all the siblings played together. She made everybody laugh. She was really silly, but really caring.
If you would have known her, you would say, oh my God, I just love being around her because she's so bubbly, so happy all the time.
She was one of those ones that people just draw to her.
By the time she was in high school, Tavia was drawing attention from the opposite sex as well.
She had this bright, big, pretty smile. And she had pretty big eyes too, but she was gorgeous. Guys were attracted to Tavia.
Despite all the attention from the boys at school, Tavia never lost sight of the bigger picture.
Tavia stuck with her education, and that was the only point that she had. All she wanted was to be in the books, be successful, and make it in life. She always wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to start off in phlebotomy, then get more education and become a nurse.
But there was one young man who Tavia was willing to take off from her schoolwork to be with.
Hey, boo.
Hey, baby. When are you going to?
Lamondre Tucker.
What do you think? To see you.
Most of the girls loved him.
Baby, I told you I needed to study all day.
Mondre was a handsome boy. He was. He had long hair, tall. This always was Mondre. Oh, Mondre would do this, or Mondre wanted to do that.
A star athlete on the football field, Lamondre had been smitten with Tavia since middle school.
They started dating in the 8th grade. He would come to her birthday parties, and they would talk and everything.
By their senior year in high school, the pair's friendship had morphed into a full-fledged romance.
You know my mama catch us, we in trouble, right?
I was not thinking of your mama.
I think what drew Tavia to Lamondre was that he was in school, playing football, star football player, just goofy like her, just a nice personality like her. She liked horses, and he rode horses with a trail ride club. Just personality, I believe, drew her close to him.
Tavia was happy with her relationship with Lamondre.
Tavia was in love with Lamondre. It wasn't just love. She was actually in love with him. She really cared about it.
So, after high school, you think we'll be together forever?
Of course.
Me.
By the spring of 2008, with graduation looming, life had never looked better for the young couple. Tavia had been accepted to Southern University, while Lamondre was fielding offers from major college football programs.
He had discussed college scholarships with a number of schools.
But that summer after graduation, Tavia made a confession to her close friend, Sharon Green.
I see it. What's going on? Okay, I gotta tell you something.
She was like, you can't tell anybody, but I think I might be pregnant.
You're pregnant. Okay.
She said that Mondre was her father.
You're serious?
I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this.
I'm trying to go to school. Yeah, I can't go to class with a baby. You can do it.
So she took a pregnancy test and she was pregnant. And at that point, she told her family and decided to keep the baby.
I was kind of shocked when I found out that Tavia was intimate at all. I didn't think Tavia was doing anything like that. But, considering she's a teenager, that's what teenagers do. I told her, don't worry about it. Just do what you need to do and, we'll take care of the baby. I was excited for her when she got pregnant. I honestly was. I was like, I have a new niece or nephew by my baby sister.
All right, y'all. Presents, come on.
As for Lamondre, he seemed thrilled at the prospect of being a father.
He said, it's my baby. I'll do what I can to take care of it. He was excited. He actually told my mom and myself that the baby in the ultrasound actually looked like him.
He gonna play basketball.
Oh,
because I already did football, so we already got that discovered.
Yeah.
With Lamondre standing by Tavia's side, the couple's future still seemed as bright as ever.
Even with pregnancy, the couple kept working towards their goals. Tavia was preparing to enroll in Southern University, and Lamondre was working hard to boost his GPA to better his chances of getting into a school with great academics and great football.
But little did anyone know that in just 2 short months, a shocking disappearance would rip apart their lives. A mystery that would propel a family on a frantic search for the truth and leave a community desperate for answers.
We didn't know whether something had happened or she was lost somewhere. We didn't know.
In the fall of 2008, 18-year-old Tavia Sills seemed on top of the world. Smart, beautiful, and deeply ambitious, Tavia was well on her way to fulfilling her lifelong dream of becoming a nurse.
Tavia always wanted to help others throughout her life, and that's basically what she did. She stayed in her books. When she graduated, she went on to Southern University. She did her very best. Even when she got into college, she was determined to make the grade and do what she had to do.
And the fact that she was 5 months pregnant didn't slow Tavia down one bit.
She finished school. She's in college now. Tavia's gonna have a baby. Perfect. Tavia was in love with Mondre. Since middle school. So it was a joy.
Lamondre was really supportive, even though he was focused on getting his academics in order so that he could play college football at the highest possible level. He always made time for Tavia.
But on the evening of September 9th, 2008, Tavia and Lamondre's life takes a dramatic turn. It starts when Detective Rodney Demery of the Shreveport Police Department receives a call from Tavia's mother, Vicki Britton.
Miss Britton reported that Miss Sills, her daughter, had not returned home. She was very, very in touch with her daughter. I think they had a very special relationship. The fact that Tavia didn't call her alarmed her.
Detective Demery heads to the Sills home to take a statement.
Can you tell us the last time you seen Tavia?
It was about 7:30. She said her and Lamondre was going to go out.
Tavia came in and she told me that Lamondre wanted to know, was it okay if he took her to meet his sister on his dad's side. She looked at me and she said, I love you. I said, I love you too, baby.
Vicki says Lamondre returned to their home a half hour later, all alone.
He knocked on my bedroom door and said, I just come to tell you that I dropped Tavia out at the apartment.
He took Tavia to the Prince Village apartment so she could see her sister. And he left her there, and then he returned to her home and explained to her parents that he had left her there.
It's unlike Tavia not to answer her phone.
Well, maybe there's a reasonable explanation. Maybe her phone died or something.
Well, you see, there is something else.
I told him about the rape.
According to Vicki, the incident had occurred at a nearby park while Tavia and Lamondre were on a date back in July.
Tavia and Lamondre went riding, and they parked at the David Raines Park. Two guys came to the car, put guns to their head.
Whoa! Oh my God! Shut the hell up, or you're dead.
They blindfolded my sister and made Lamondre drive. And they drove her past the train station that's right up the road from the park. And once they got down there, they took her out the car, still blindfolded.
She was scared for her life. She didn't know what to do. And she said she automatically started praying. And then she started to hear Lamondre scream. And she thought they had to be hitting him.
He said, I'm pregnant. Please, you don't want to do this. Please.
They threw her on the ground, they stomped on her, they raped her.
This terrible event went on for a while, but before the attackers fled the scene, they delivered a threat to Lamondre and Tavia.
Don't tell anybody, or I'll kill you and your family.
When Tavia told me that, I told her she needed to call the police. And she was telling me that they had told her that if she told anybody, they were going to kill the whole family. And I told her, don't worry about us. God had us. We were going to be safe. And she called the police department.
But as she spoke to police, Tavia began having second thoughts.
She asked the police if she reported it, would they be able to protect her family? And the police told her they couldn't guarantee her that. So therefore, the rape never got reported because she wouldn't. I tried to report it, but because of her age, because of Tavia's age, she had to be the one to do it.
Thankfully, a hospital visit revealed the rape had caused no harm to Tavia's unborn child. Tavia was relieved, and in the months that followed, she and Lamondre tried to stay positive and put their life back together. But it wasn't easy.
I noticed a lot of change in her. She didn't want to sleep in her own bed. She didn't want to sit near a window.
It seemed like her and Lamondre were there for each other in the wake of the attack. But something like that could really hurt a relationship, especially one where the couple is expecting a child.
For detectives, the rape allegations are a significant development in Tavia's disappearance.
Maybe these two guys came back. Is it possible that they had heard that Tavia told her family about the attack, and they wanted to make sure that she could never testify against them?
But without an incident report, investigators don't have much to work with. So they start with the one person who might be able to help them, Lamondre.
He was the last person that she was with. So if he did drop her off where he said he did, or anything along those lines, I wanted to get that information from him.
Well, do you know where Lamondre might be right now?
No, but I can call him and we can get him over here right now.
Lamondre is more than willing to help detectives any way he can.
He was just willing to share a helping hand.
He gave Detective Demery the same version of events that he had given to Vicki Britton, Tavia's mother. Said that he had dropped her off at the Prince Village Apartments.
According to Lamondre, he and Tavia left her parents' house a few minutes before 7:30, bound for his sister's house.
Once we got to my sister's house, I knocked I don't know how many times, and no one answered. So when we was going back to her parents' house, she said she wanted to go to her sister's house. I said, that's fine.
He said, well, me and Tay, we talked about the baby and things like that, and she said she needed some clothes and her hair done, so I dropped her off at the apartments.
So after I dropped her at her sister's house, I went back to her parents' house just to tell her where she's at.
And have you spoken with Tavia since then?
No, I've been trying to find her. I tried to figure out where she might be. Nowhere. I'm just hoping it had nothing to do with the incident.
You mean the assault?
Yeah.
You have any idea who these men were?
No.
Lamondre was cooperative, and there was no evidence of foul play. So I think everyone was still holding out hope that Tavia would safely turn up.
Tavia's sister.
After speaking with Lamondre, investigators reach out to Tavia's sister, Tequila. She tells them Tavia never made it to her apartment that night.
I was actually in the hospital when I found out Tavia was missing.
Tavia didn't call me. She didn't come and visit me, and I thought that that was very unusual for Tavia, so I started to get a little worried.
At this point, there were a lot of questions. Had someone been following Tavia and abducted her when Lamondre dropped her off outside her sister's apartment? Had Lamondre seen her enter the apartment? Or did he just assume she got in there safely? And who are these men that attacked her and Lamondre in July? Are they possibly responsible for her disappearance?
But as the search for Tavia intensifies, another revelation will come to light. One that will rock Tavia's friends and family to their core.
I balled up like a baby and my heart was racing. You know, I was praying to God to help me, help my heart stop racing so I'll be able to accept what I'm about to hear.
It's September 9th, 2008. 18-year-old mother-to-be Tavia Sills has disappeared without a trace.
That particular night, we didn't get no sleep. We got up the next morning and we went about looking around.
I was concerned about my child. You know, I was praying to God to help me.
We just went asking around, anybody saw her, and all of her friends and all of that, and no one seemed to have saw her. I knew then something was wrong.
Shreveport investigators share that fear, especially after learning that two unknown men had violently raped Tavia a few months earlier and threatened to kill her if she or her boyfriend Lamondre told anyone about the incident.
That was very troubling and certainly made these unknown assailants public enemy number one in this case and likely responsible for Tavia's disappearance.
Knowing that Tavia is 5 months pregnant and is possibly the target of a murder plot, detectives waived the mandatory 24-hour grace period. And with the help of her family, the search for Tavia is at full speed within hours.
We printed flyers. People from school, from Green Oaks High School, got off the buses and came. Help look, search.
We had put out posters and tried to get her picture put out on media.
On day 3 of the search, Detective Rod Demery receives a call from a colleague that changes everything.
I get a phone call from a person at the police department told me that they had found a body at a desolate location in a pond in the same area of town where Tavia lived.
There was an older couple who were out fishing this particular day, and the man noticed what he observed on the surface of the pond to be a body.
As Detective Demery races to the scene, he gets a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach.
I kind of suspect that it was going to have a very bad ending.
But after the corpse is pulled from the pond, it's clear a quick identification won't be easy.
It's pretty far decomposed. Can't tell if it's male or female.
You know, as the body starts to decompose under the water, it's kind of rapid. So it was very, very difficult to determine whether or not it was a male, female, or even the race.
Can we determine what was the cause of death?
We're guessing this person's been shot. We've got a casing and a piece of gum.
There was no way to tell what the initial wounds were until the body was actually brought out and examined. We knew she had on some blue jeans and some sneakers. I instructed the crime scene folks on what areas I wanted to pay particular attention to. We retrieved some chewing gum to try to grab some DNA. Then it takes several weeks.
While awaiting the results of the examination, Detective Demery pays Tavia's family another visit.
There was no certainty that it was Miss Sills at that point, but it was suspected. And I went to her house.
And that's when he told me that they had found a body in the pond. And they had every reason to believe that it was Tavia.
What was she wearing?
What we saw so far, she had on jeans, blue shoes, and a brown hoodie.
No.
It was her.
Oh my God, no.
I just couldn't believe that this was real, this was happening to me. You know, one of my children. I just felt like my life was over. I broke down. It took at least 3 or 4 of them to keep me up. I cried. I asked for my kids. I wanted my mom. I laid in the bed with my mom for hours.
To know that they not only lost their daughter, but also their grandchild. It's just horrendous pain.
While Tavia's family and friends struggle to come to grips with what's happened, examiners at the coroner's office are trying to piece together exactly how Tavia died.
Once they were able to turn the body over, it was immediately apparent to them that there were gunshot wounds in the body and that it was not a case of an accidental drowning. It was a case of murder.
Tavia had a gunshot wound to the back that pierced the lung. She had one, they said, grazed the armpit, and if I'm not mistaken, one grazed the Adam's apple area of her neck.
A search of the area where Tavia's body was found yields additional evidence.
They found 3 .40 caliber shell casings, but no gun. This looks like an execution, and starting to look more and more like the 2 men who assaulted Lamondre and Tavia back in July carried out her murder. But how do you find these men when you have no idea who they are or what they look like?
My next question is, where's the gun now?
But when Detective Demery does track down the gun's whereabouts, it turns the whole case upside down.
I was terribly bothered by the case. It was one of those cases that made me rethink what I did for a living.
You don't have to do no, please don't do it.
On September 12, 2008, the search for missing 18-year-old Tavia Sills came to a heartbreaking end when her pregnant body was found floating in a pond a few miles from her home in Shreveport, Louisiana.
She had been shot to death.
The first thing that went through my head when they found Tavia's body was the fact that I don't have a best friend anymore. She's gone, and I can't find anybody to replace her because it's nobody else like her.
So far, we've got a .40 caliber casing.
Shell casings found at the crime scene suggest a possible connection between Tavia's murder and the prior assault on her and her boyfriend, Lamondre Tucker.
My next order of business was to find him. I immediately went to his home. His mother was there.
Miss Tucker,
Yes?
could you tell me if Lamondre is home?
No, he isn't.
Can you tell me where he is?
He's probably with his girlfriend.
But in a shocking twist, the girlfriend Lamondre's mother is referring to isn't Tavia.
I found out Tucker also had another girlfriend. He had a child with that girlfriend.
What is his girlfriend's name?
Jeanette Banks.
Can you tell me where she lives?
Yeah, she just lives right down the street.
Detectives find Jeanette and immediately start pressing her for information.
We need to speak with your boyfriend, Lamondre Tucker. Is he here?
No, he isn't.
Do you mind if we ask you some questions about you and his relationship?
Okay.
To start, how long you two been together?
Jeanette told them that she and Lamondre did have a young child together and that they had been dating on and off for over a year.
Well, the reason we're here today is a young lady was found murdered, and we think she was involved with Lamondre. Did you know about his relationship with Tavia Seals?
Yes, I did.
She admitted she knew about the relationship. In fact, just before the murder, a friend told her that Lamondre was expecting another baby with Tavia.
Well, how did his relationship with Miss Seals make you feel?
How do you think it made me feel? I was pissed. You know, I just wanted him to start doing right by me, and I wanted her to stay away from my man.
I think his girlfriend had issue with maybe his philandering, for a better word.
Given the fact that Tavia's attackers are still in the wind, investigators wonder if Jeanette might have had a hand in the murder.
I don't know if she knew the extent of his relationship with Tavia, but I learned that Tavia's pregnancy was gonna cause some problems.
But Jeanette is quick to rebuff any such suggestion.
When she heard about that Tavia was pregnant, that Lamondre was messing with Tavia, that she no longer wanted anything to do with.
Did you have anything to do with Tavia's murder?
Of course not. Look, Lamondre ain't worth killing nobody over.
At first, it was some suspicions that she was involved, but after the investigation went on and everything, she wasn't involved.
While detectives can rule Jeanette out as a suspect, the fact that Lamondre Tucker had more than one woman in his life is troublesome. Hoping to learn more about Lamondre and Tavia's relationship, investigators sit down with Tavia's best friend and confidant, Sharon Green.
To start off, Tavia was happy with Lamondre, but eventually it went sour because he was kind of like a ladies' man.
He was on the football team, so he kind of had an ego, and he would flirt, text other girls while he was with Tavia.
At the time that Tavia became pregnant, she really wanted the child to be his child, but he wasn't happy about the fact that she was pregnant.
Sharon tells detectives that after the alleged rape, Lamondre seemed to have a change of heart and began doting on Tavia once again. But the more details Tavia divulged about the alleged rape, the more suspicious Sharon became.
When Tavia told me about the rape and all of the stuff that happened in the middle of the night, my first thought was Lamondre set this up.
And even after it happened, he never went out to try to figure out who did it or what happened or who the guys were.
He wasn't concerned at all.
But more telling to Sharon were Lamondre's lack of physical wounds.
She says that she could hear someone was hitting Lamondre with a gun. I actually told her, I believe he had you set up because if he's hitting with a gun, he's gonna bruise. Some bruises gonna show.
If you was being beat with a gun or anything, punches or anything, you're too bright to not have not one scratch or bruise.
Could Lamondre really have set up such an elaborate ruse in an attempt to force Tavia to have a miscarriage? Detectives are skeptical, but Sharon doesn't waver.
Absolutely.
I honestly believe that the motive was to get rid of the child, not to kill her, but to get rid of the child.
But before detectives can confirm Sharon Green's assumptions, another shocking piece of evidence will surface. One that proves just how deep one woman's love for her man was, and how far someone would go to silence her forever.
She was in a pond with bullet holes in her, and there are snakes swimming around her. This guy's firing more shots at her, and she's thinking about him getting in trouble. It's just amazing.
Following the shooting death of 18-year-old Tavia Sills, police in Shreveport, Louisiana found themselves swimming in a sea of potential suspects. But Tavia's best friend, Sharon Green, has just told police that Tavia's murder and her brutal rape 2 months earlier may well have been orchestrated by the father of Tavia's unborn child, high school sweetheart Lamondre Tucker.
Her friend Sharon Green came and told the police that the whole thing about the rape was because she was pregnant at the time. That was Lamondre's thing that he set up to try to make her lose the baby.
But could Lamondre, who'd carried a torch for Tavia for years, really be behind such a terrible crime?
On the surface, it seemed impossible. This was someone she loved and trusted. They had known each other their whole lives. Their families knew each other. But at the same time, if he was capable of possibly staging a rape, what's to say he couldn't orchestrate a murder?
Either way, investigators know they need to find Lamondre and talk to him again. Within hours, they track him down.
He was at his aunt's house, which was in another neighborhood. And I immediately went to that neighborhood and gathered up Mr. Tucker and brought him in for questioning.
But if Lamondre thinks he's in trouble, he sure doesn't act like it.
He had this bravado that I don't have anything to be concerned about.
Well, we're not going to beat around the bush, Lamondre, because we know about the rape, we know about the other girlfriend, and we know you probably weren't too happy about being a father again. So tell us the truth.
I told y'all, man. I didn't know nothing about the death or the rape.
I listened to a story, just to let him get it out, I guess. I just didn't buy anything that he said.
And why should we believe that?
Why wouldn't you believe it?
Following Lamondre's interrogation, investigators decide to hold him overnight. During the next few hours, they work feverishly to build their case against him.
After I became involved, I realized that Tucker had told the police earlier on that he had dropped her off at an apartment complex. And then I did find out that there was video surveillance at that apartment complex.
It confirmed, in fact, that Tavia had never been there that night.
That morning, Detective Dimery brings Lamondre in for another round of questioning.
I told him that we had recovered the video surveillance from that apartment complex, and he didn't drop her off.
You're not on the footage. Taylor's not on the footage either.
You kidding, right?
No, we're serious. So where'd you take her that night? Because it went to her sister's apartment for sure.
It's then that Lamondre makes a startling confession.
He admits that on September 9th, he and Tavia went fishing at the same pond where they found Tavia's body, and they weren't alone.
He was with a friend of his, Marcus Taylor. He said that he found a tackle box with a firearm or something or another. And as he continued to talk, he kind of caught himself up in his own stories that were just not making any sense.
Tavia thought it was cute to play like it was an action movie or something, and she dropped it and it went off.
So it accidentally went off 3 times? Because Tavia had 3 gunshot wounds in her body.
According to Lamondre, after the gun discharged 3 times, he and Marcus panicked and threw the gun into a nearby drainage ditch.
If we go out there, will we find the gun?
Yes, sir. I put it in the ditch because I knew y'all would try to blame me about something like this.
We went to that location. The diver located the firearm that matched the shell casings at the crime scene. It was semi-automatic, 40 caliber.
With Lamondre in custody, the next step is hauling in the other man allegedly present at the scene, Lamondre's 21-year-old friend, Marcus Taylor.
He had, educational problems, learning problems, a learning disability.
He was mentally very challenged. Today's nomenclature would describe him as intellectually disabled. He was a grown man, lived with his mother, but had 2 children of his own.
Marcus, you want to tell us about a fishing trip you and Lamondre took?
When investigators sit down with Marcus on September 18th, 2008, at first he's reluctant to talk.
Fishing trip down to the pond with you, Lamondre, and Tavia.
Taylor had no idea that Tucker had told me everything. He was very reluctant. He was very guarded, denying everything, absolutely admitting to nothing. At that point, Marcus Taylor found out that we knew everything.
We knew about the tackle box. We knew about the gun.
Okay. I'll tell you everything.
Taylor actually went to the crime scene with me and showed me where everything took place.
At the crime scene, Marcus Taylor's story differs remarkably from Lamondre's version of events.
Marcus says that it was no accident that they found a gun that evening.
Tucker had solicited Taylor's help in this, and indeed it was Taylor's gun. Taylor also accompanied Tucker and Tavia to the pond, ostensibly to convince her or to lure her there under the guise that they were going to go fishing.
Taylor said he began to pretend as if though he was fishing.
Marcus, how do I do this?
You just pull the little fishy thing down and throw it out there.
He said he looked over to his left and he saw that Lamondre had the gun pointed at Tavia.
Lamondre, can you help?
He said Lamondre fired a shot and fired another shot. At some point, Miss Seals was on the ground.
They had doused her with fighter fluid and was trying to set on fire.
They threw the accelerant on her body. And Taylor told me that she jumped in the water at that point. She was conscious. She had to be in pain. She had to be frightened to death. And the water was literally a snake pit.
This area is hazardous and known for being snake infested. At this time of year, it would have been swarming.
Marcus says he heard Tavia begging Lamondre to spare her life.
No, Mom, please don't do this. No, you don't have to do this. I promise I won't.
Tavia was in the water, and she was saying, Lamondre, leave. I won't tell anybody what you did. I love you. At some point, Taylor got scared. He said that he just took off running. He said when he got halfway down the pathway, he heard another gunshot or another couple of gunshots. She was in a pond with bullet holes in her. They had tried to burn her, and there's snakes swimming around her. This guy's firing more shots at her, and she's thinking about him getting in trouble. It's just amazing.
Based on Marcus Taylor's statement, investigators believe that Tavia bled to death in the snake-infested water just moments after Marcus and Lamondre fled the scene.
Marcus, we really do appreciate you coming here and telling us the truth.
Marcus Taylor's statement gives investigators everything they need to hear to charge both him and Lamondre Tucker with Tavia's murder.
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that Lamondre had actually taken Tavia's life. He just didn't come off like that type of person. He really didn't. It was just a total shock. It really was.
I think he's insane to think that he can actually do this to a person. Who would do that to a human being?
But as this case heads to trial, prosecutors may have one last hurdle to jump over. It seems Lamondre could walk on a technicality.
One of the things that I worried about most in this case is that he did not understand the legal rights that led to his own confession.
On March 20th, 2011, Lamondre Tucker, the man prosecutors say masterminded the murder of his pregnant 18-year-old girlfriend Tavia Sills, is escorted into a Shreveport, Louisiana courtroom to stand trial.
I just couldn't believe he had did something to her. I couldn't believe that Lamondre actually killed my daughter. This was Tavia, my child, my middle girl.
In their opening statements, prosecutors argue that ending Tavia's pregnancy was at the heart of Lamondre's murder motive.
The motive here is that Tucker had another relationship with another woman by whom he had a child. And that was the relationship that he believed to be the more serious one for him. That is the relationship that he did not want disturbed. And so when Tavia became pregnant, Tucker became obsessed with removing that child and Tavia from the scene because that would interfere with his other relationship.
According to prosecutors, Lamondre put this deadly plan into motion on the early evening of September 9th, 2008.
He tells his friend Marcus Taylor to bring a gun, lighter fluid, and matches, and they go to Tavia's house to pick her up. Eventually, they all drive to the pond under the guise that they're all going fishing.
It was their intent to burn her up and therefore destroy any evidence of her body.
He shot her 3 times. The fatal bullet hit her right lung and filled up and killed her.
Then after that, Lamondre returned to the Brittons' home. He lied right to their faces and told them that he had dropped off Tavia at her sister's, knowing full well that she was never going to come home.
Defense attorneys counter by asserting that police did not adhere to due process when eliciting confessions from Lamondre and his accomplice, Marcus Taylor.
The emphasis was on the fact that he was very young and that he did not understand the legal rights that Detective Demery gave him, and therefore his confessions were coerced.
On March 23, 2011, the jury retires to deliberate Lamondre's fate.
They found him guilty of first-degree murder. And then after a period of time, the judge imposed the death penalty.
I'm like most of my people not really believing in a death penalty. I'm the type of person that if you do the crime and you do that type of crime, you should get what you deserve. Get what you deserve.
He showed no remorse. He never apologized. He never said, "I'm sorry." Just nothing.
As for Marcus Taylor, he's also found guilty.
I don't think he really grasped the true depth of what he was doing. So he wound up, Taylor, getting 30 years.
I believe in my heart, rather, that Lamondre just used him because he knew that this boy had a learning disability. His IQ was very low, and he needed somebody that he could use to help him do what he done.
The rain that battered the cracked asphalt of a neon-drenched Manhattan street on a freezing November night back in 1982 did more than just wash away the grime of a decaying city. It completely erased the final, frantic footsteps of a human being whose sudden, violent disappearance would remain an open, bleeding wound in the heart of New York for more than 44 years. It was the era of grimy subways, flickering street lamps, and a city teetering on the edge of social collapse. Yet beneath that deafening roar of urban chaos, a far more calculating, cold-blooded horror was being executed in the shadows of a locked Greenwich Village apartment. A young, ambitious professional with everything to live for vanished into thin air without leaving behind a single trace of a struggle, a drop of blood, or a defensive footprint, leaving an entire apartment complex to wake up to a suffocating, absolute silence that would haunt them for generations. The initial response from the New York Police Department was swift but inherently flawed, hampered by the primitive forensic tools of the pre-digital era and a staggering wave of local crime that stretched the homicide squads to their absolute breaking point. Detectives stood in the sterile, undisturbed living room, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee and an open book on the side table, realizing with a mounting sense of dread that they were looking at a masterclass in clean, predatory extraction. For over 4 decades, that empty apartment remained a permanent ghost in the machine of the precinct, a chilling reminder that some monsters do not look like the desperate criminals lurking in dark alleyways. Some possess the clinical, terrifying patience to blend seamlessly into the background noise of the city, waiting for the perfect, unmonitored second to strike and then disappear forever into the vast, human ocean of America. The investigation launched into a frantic, high-stakes dragnet that consumed the energy of 3 different precincts, transforming the local precinct house into a chaotic war room lined with grainy black-and-white photographs, transit timelines, and the desperate, weeping faces of a family plunged into a permanent living hell. Detectives worked in grueling, overlapping shifts, combing through hundreds of thousands of paper files, interviewing every bartender, taxi driver, and transient laborer who had crossed through the Lower West Side on that fateful night, and chasing anonymous tips that led absolutely nowhere. Every lead was treated like the ultimate breakthrough, prompting late-night raids on abandoned piers along the Hudson River, the frantic dragging of dark harbor waters, and the cross-referencing of every unidentified body recovered from the tri-state area. Yet, for all the sweat expended and the administrative pressure applied by City Hall, the file remained obstinately hollow, a frustrating collection of dead ends, unverified alibis, and conflicting eyewitness testimonies that defied the combined instincts of the city's most seasoned investigators. The primary suspect, a charming, highly intelligent acquaintance who had been the last person seen near the building, vanished from the grid less than 48 hours after the initial questioning, leaving behind a fabricated social security number, a trail of abandoned aliases, and a mocking void that left the police department chasing ghosts. As the weeks bled into agonizing months, the crushing weight of the absolute deadlock settled heavily over the cold case unit, casting a dark, permanent shadow over the careers of the men who had sworn an oath to bring the missing soul home. The decades that followed did not heal the wound. They allowed it to fester into a deep, cultural trauma that defined an entire generation of New Yorkers, an unsolved mystery that became synonymous with the terrifying ease with which a person could be erased from existence in the pre-digital age. The name of the victim was no longer just a memory of a vibrant life. It had transformed into a cautionary tale, a grim urban legend whispered by terrified parents to keep their children from trusting the polished, polite strangers who occupied the modern office buildings and high-end brownstones of a changing Manhattan. The Greenwich Village apartment complex became an accidental monument to horror, its rental values fluctuating as prospective tenants felt an instinctual, chilling revulsion the moment they stepped into the narrow, wood-paneled hallways where the predator had once walked unchecked. True crime sleuths and independent journalists kept the file alive on early internet forums, spinning wild, unsubstantiated conspiracies about international spy rings, witness protection program failures, and high-profile institutional cover-ups, further muddying the waters and torturing the surviving family members with a continuous cycle of false hope. The physical case file, once a crisp stack of paper, grew yellow, frayed, and massive, filling multiple cardboard boxes in the subterranean archives of the police department, a silent, heavy testament to a multi-generational failure of justice. But the universe has a violent, unpredictable way of balancing its accounts when the living have entirely run out of options, and the true catalyst for resolution was never going to be found in a pristine forensic laboratory or a sudden flash of conscience from the criminal underbelly. The shattering breakthrough originated thousands of miles away from the crowded streets of New York, deep within the sun-drenched, tranquil suburban avenues of a wealthy coastal community in Southern California where a beloved, grandfatherly figure had just celebrated his 81st birthday. It began not with a dramatic police raid or a deathbed confession, but with a mundane, automated digital synchronization of a modern State Department of Motor Vehicles database that was updating its facial recognition security protocols for elderly drivers' license renewals. An advanced artificial intelligence algorithm, scanning through millions of historical portraits to flag identity fraud and duplicate credentials, suddenly flagged a microscopic, mathematical match between the smiling, wrinkled face of a respected local philanthropist and a grainy, 44-year-old mugshot of a fugitive wanted for kidnapping and murder in New York City. This single, silent digital alert acted like a high-voltage current surging through a long-dead circuit, instantly shattering a meticulously constructed double life that had survived completely unmonitored for nearly half a century. The realization that the primary suspect from the 1982 Manhattan cold case had not fled the country, died in anonymity, or crossed into the criminal underworld, but had instead reinvented himself as a pillar of a quiet West Coast community, sent a profound shockwave through the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. A specialized joint task force consisting of NYPD cold case detectives, FBI fugitive recovery specialists, and local California authorities was quietly assembled under a cloud of absolute operational secrecy, knowing that if a single detail leaked out, the suspect could easily utilize his substantial financial resources to vanish once again into the shadows. Investigators spent days conducting discreet, long-range surveillance on the elderly man, watching in absolute fascination and horror as the target mowed his immaculate lawn, chatted politely with local police officers at community fundraisers, and played with his great-grandchildren in the park. He had spent 44 years wearing a flawless mask of absolute civic virtue, building a successful real estate empire, marrying into a prominent local family, and donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to local charities, all while keeping the dark, blood-drenched reality of his true identity hidden deep beneath the floorboards of his pristine suburban existence. The logistical coordination required to execute the arrest was immense, requiring tactical units to secure the perimeter of the suspect's luxury estate under the guise of a routine traffic safety detail to minimize the potential for a high-stakes standoff or a sudden suicide attempt by an old man facing the absolute end of his freedom. The public remained entirely oblivious to the shifting tides of history, creating a bizarre, surreal contrast between the normal, everyday rhythm of the quiet California neighborhood and the high-tension drama unfolding as heavily armed agents quietly swarmed the property in the bright afternoon sunlight. When the tactical team finally breached the front door, the elderly philanthropist did not reach for a weapon or attempt to flee. He simply stood in his pristine, sun-drenched kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as his eyes locked onto the New York badges worn by the lead detectives. The decades of carefully cultivated deception, the false name he had checked into every hotel with, and the immaculate middle-class persona he had lived for 44 years dissolved in a matter of seconds as the lead investigator stepped forward, called him by his true 1982 Manhattan identity, and informed him that his double life had officially run out of time. The immediate aftermath of the arrest triggered an unprecedented media frenzy that put both New York and Southern California under an unblinking national spotlight, the public transfixed by the chilling revelation of a modern Jekyll and Hyde story operating in plain sight. The local news channels broke into regular programming with flashing red graphics, the words, "New York 1982 cold case solved, fugitive living double life finally caught," searing themselves into the minds of viewers who had long believed that the passage of 40 years was an absolute shield against criminal accountability. Inside the secure interrogation facility where the suspect was held pending extradition, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, a high-stakes battle of psychological endurance between seasoned modern homicide detectives and an old man who had spent half his life believing he had committed the absolute perfect crime. The 1982 case file sat on the metal table between them like a ticking bomb, its yellowed pages and vintage crime scene photographs starkly contrasting with the high-definition digital monitors that tracked every variance in the suspect's heart rate and vocal inflections as he attempted to maintain his final, desperate barrier of denial. The psychological collapse that followed was a masterclass in forensic interrogation, a slow, agonizing unraveling of an ego that had been reinforced by 44 years of total evasion and social respectability. The suspect's polite, grandfatherly demeanor quickly eroded, replacing his calm exterior with a pale, sweating desperation as detectives systematically laid out the mathematical precision of the facial recognition data, the preserved fingerprint matches from the 1982 Greenwich Village apartment, and the financial records that proved his flight from New York coincided precisely with the victim's disappearance. For hours, the old man fought a losing battle against the relentless march of modern forensic science, trying to claim a case of mistaken identity, a long-forgotten twin, or a vast bureaucratic error, but the trap had been laid with absolute, flawless precision. When the lead detective finally leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper, and played a vintage audio recording of the victim's family pleading for answers from the winter of 1982, the final dam of resistance broke, and the fugitive began to weep, his confession flowing out like a toxic torrent that filled the digital recorders with 46 minutes of pure, unadulterated horror that finally stripped the mask away from the monster once and for all. The extradition process and the subsequent historical trial in a packed Manhattan courtroom became a massive, national cultural phenomenon, forcing an aging city to confront the gruesome reality of a crime that had been frozen in time while the rest of the world moved forward into the digital age. The gallery was filled to absolute capacity every single day, occupied by original neighbors who had flown in from across the country, retired detectives who walked with the assistance of canes, and ordinary citizens who wanted to see how a 44-year-old sin would finally be answered under the modern architecture of justice. The prosecution laid out the case with devastating, clinical efficiency, using the suspect's West Coast real estate records and tax histories to demonstrate how he had systematically weaponized his intelligence to forge a completely new identity from the stolen credentials of a deceased infant, building a monument of prosperity on top of a foundation of pure malice. The defense tried desperately to argue for leniency, pointing to the suspect's decades of charity work, his frail physical health, and his status as a loving family man in California, but the prosecution remained entirely unyielding, reminding the jury that a lifetime of performative virtue cannot buy forgiveness for the cold-blooded destruction of a young soul whose future was violently stolen in 1982. The final verdict of guilty on all counts was a moment of profound, shattering finality that brought a permanent, unyielding close to the longest-running fugitive mystery in the history of the precinct, ensuring that the old man would spend the remaining days of his natural life behind the bleak concrete walls of a maximum-security New York penitentiary. The suspect showed no visible reaction as the sentence was pronounced, his eyes remaining fixed on his shackled hands, a hollow, defeated shell of a man whose double life had ultimately served as his own eternal trap. The surviving members of the victim's family, who had spent 44 years suspended in a hellish limbo of not knowing, received the news not with celebration, but with an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion that spoke to the immense toll of carrying a multi-generational grief across nearly half a century of silence. The Greenwich Village neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath on the night the trial concluded, a feeling that a massive, historical debt had finally been paid in full, even if the currency was tragedy, loss, and the bittersweet reality of a justice that took a lifetime to arrive. In the quiet, cool months that followed the conclusion of the trial, as the national media trucks packed up their gear and the true crime podcasters moved on to other mysteries, a solemn, reflective peace settled over the streets of Manhattan where the nightmare had originally taken root. The story of the 1982 cold case became a permanent, foundational legend within the ranks of the New York Police Department, taught to every incoming class of recruits as the ultimate parable of forensic persistence, a definitive proof that no matter how far a fugitive runs, no matter how flawless the double life they construct, and no matter how many decades the darkness tries to protect the secret, the truth possesses a unique, unyielding weight that will eventually break through the floorboards of time and drag the monster into the light. And as the modern city of New York continues to reinvent itself, its towering glass skyscrapers reflecting the morning sun, and its streets filled with the chaotic, vibrant energy of a new generation that never knew the grimy darkness of 1982, the memory of the young soul who is lost and finally found remains a permanent, grounding frequency in the city's heart. A reminder that the dead are never truly forgotten, and that justice, no matter how long delayed, will always carry the final, absolute word. The ripples of the conviction did not stop with the closing of the trial. They tore through the quiet California community where the suspect had lived his double life, leaving an entire town to re-examine decades of shared memories with a sickening sense of retroactive terror. Neighbors who had hosted dinner parties for the elderly philanthropist found themselves staring at old photographs with a profound sense of revulsion, realizing that the gentle, polite man who had sat at their tables was a cold-blooded executioner who had escaped the electric chair through a lifetime of absolute deception. The local charities that had accepted his financial donations scrambled to return or isolate the funds, desperate to purge their organizations of any connection to a fortune built on the foundations of a historical homicide. The suspect's West Coast family, completely innocent of his past and utterly shattered by the revelation, withdrew into absolute anonymity, forced to carry the crushing weight of a legacy that had been transformed overnight from an American success story into a horrifying chronicle of sociopathic camouflage. Inside the data centers of the Federal Fugitive Recovery Networks, the case triggered a massive, systemic audit of millions of historical missing persons files and unsolved homicides from the late 20th century, with analysts utilizing the advanced facial recognition matrix to search for other static nomads who might be hiding within the retirement communities of the Sun Belt. The success of the New York 1982 cold case proved that the passage of time was no longer a viable defense against modern digital synchronization, prompting law enforcement agencies nationwide to aggressively digitize their legacy paper archives and feed them into centralized artificial intelligence systems. The narrative had completely outgrown the boundaries of a single solved homicide. It had become a national blueprint for historical accountability, a declaration to every aging fugitive still harboring a dark secret that their masks of normalcy were inherently fragile, and that a single digital check at a DMV office could bring their entire world crashing down around them in a single afternoon. The physical reality of the suspect's operational methods during his 44 years on the run became a subject of intense study for behavioral profilers at the FBI Academy, who sought to understand how an individual could maintain such a high level of psychological compartmentalization without suffering a complete mental breakdown. The forensic analysis of his personal computer, his financial ledgers, and the hidden compartments recovered from his California estate revealed that he had maintained a highly structured, almost ritualistic process for tracking the progress of the New York investigation over the decades. Hidden within a collection of vintage, hollowed-out real estate manuals sat a collection of newspaper clippings from every major anniversary of the 1982 disappearance, a private, silent archive of his crime that he had curated while living his life as a model citizen, proving that he had never experienced a deathbed reformation or a true sense of remorse, but had instead viewed his survival as a continuous, intellectual victory over the authorities. The final resting place of the 1982 victim was eventually marked by a beautiful, permanent stone monument in a quiet cemetery upstate, funded entirely by the liquidated assets of the fugitive's West Coast estate under a special victim restitution order signed by the New York Supreme Court. The dedication ceremony was a quiet, deeply emotional gathering attended by the remaining family members, the surviving original detectives, and members of the local community who had refused to let the file be forgotten during the long decades of BTAC. The stone bore only the victim's name, the dates of her tragically short life, and a single inscription that summarized the 44-year journey of the case. The truth is not bound by time. It was the closing of a historic loop, a physical declaration that the narrative had finally been allowed to achieve a proper, dignified conclusion, shifting the memory of the young soul out of the realm of unresolved urban legends and into the sacred sanctuary of eternal peace. As the years continue to roll forward, pushing the events of 1982 deeper into the recesses of 20th century history, the lesson of the California arrest remains as sharp, terrifying, and immediate as it was the afternoon the handcuffs clicked shut in that pristine kitchen. The story stands as a permanent warning to those who believe they can outwit the slow, grinding machinery of justice, a testament to the reality that the universe does not forget a crime, even if it takes half a century to speak its final verdict. The silence that once characterized the Greenwich Village apartment building is different now. It is no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of fear, suspicion, and administrative failure, but the quiet, solemn peace of a city that fought its monsters across 2 generations of darkness and one, ensuring that the longest night in its modern fugitive history has finally met the absolute dawn. The legacy of the New York 1982 cold case ultimately settled into the academic textbooks of international criminal justice programs, where it was analyzed not as a sensational piece of true crime entertainment, but as a watershed moment in the evolution of modern law enforcement strategy. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that the traditional boundaries between active investigations and historical archives were completely artificial, and that a department's willingness to re-examine its own failures with humility and technological ambition could yield results that defied the limitations of human mortality. The story of the fugitive living a double life became a literal parable taught to young officers from Los Angeles to London, an enduring reminder that the key to solving the most baffling mysteries of the present is often waiting for them in the forgotten dust of the past, if only they have the courage, the precision, and the relentless endurance to look beneath the surface of the silence. And as the modern city of New York continues to grow, its glass towers reflecting the brilliant morning sun, and its streets filled with the vibrant energy of a new generation, the quiet memory of the frozen night that changed everything remains a permanent, grounding frequency in the city's heart. The people of Manhattan sleep with a renewed sense of security, knowing that the system possesses the memory of an elephant and the precision of a laser, and that no matter how deep the shadows, the light of persistent justice will always find a way to prevail. The file is officially closed, the stamps of completion have been applied, the cell door has locked for the final time, and the city can finally move forward, its collective conscience clear and its historical ledger balanced under the wide, open canopy of the New York sky. The deep psychological impact on the suspect's West Coast family began to manifest in quiet, devastating ways as the reality of his double life fully settled into their daily routines. His children, who had grown up believing their father was a self-made American success story built on hard work and civic virtue, found themselves trapped in a permanent state of identity crisis, unable to reconcile the loving patriarch who had kissed them goodnight with the cold-blooded killer described in the New York indictments. They were forced to change their surnames, sell their family businesses at a massive loss, and relocate to distant states just to escape the continuous glare of public scrutiny and the silent, judging eyes of their former friends. Their lives had been retroactively dismantled by a past they had no part in creating, proving that the true destruction of a serial predator's wake extends far beyond his physical victims, poisoning the lives of his own descendants across multiple generations of innocence. Meanwhile, inside the maximum security prison hospital, where the aging fugitive was being monitored under constant medical supervision, the old man's physical decline began to accelerate with an alarming velocity, his body finally giving way to the natural processes of age that he had violently denied his victims so many decades ago. Homicide detectives from several other northern jurisdictions attempted to conduct final interviews at his bedside, hoping to determine if his transient years in the early 80s had linked him to other unresolved missing persons files along the East Coast before his flight to California. But the suspect remained entirely uncooperative until his very last breath, smiling weakly through his oxygen mask and refusing to grant the final satisfaction of absolute clarity to the authorities, viewing his remaining silence as his final, petty victory over the system that had stripped him of his freedom. When the news finally broke that the suspect had died in his cell from natural causes, the reaction across New York was not one of anger, but of a profound, collective exhaustion that marked the absolute, definitive end of an era of unchecked mystery. The man who had haunted the city's institutional memory for 44 years was gone, taking the full extent of his dark secrets to an unmarked prison grave, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions that would likely never be resolved by modern forensics. The multi-agency task force was eventually dissolved, its digital systems archived, and the police museum, where the original 1982 mugshot was displayed, became a quiet place of study for future criminal justice students who wanted to understand the terrifying complexity of sociopathic camouflage. The story did not end with a neat, cinematic resolution. It dissolved into a collection of historical fragments, a puzzle with missing pieces that would forever remind the city of the fragility of peace and the enduring, terrifying weight of human malice. Yet, in the quiet Greenwich Village neighborhood where the nightmare had originally taken root, the silence that now exists is no longer a hiding place for danger. It is a space where the living can finally remember the dead without the paralyzing grip of active fear, their names spoken aloud with honor and love under the wide canopy of the changing sky. The transformation of the block from a site of historical trauma into a space of ordinary urban rhythm was the community's ultimate victory over the legacy of the predator, a declaration that the final, lasting word on that street would belong to resilience, safety, and peace. The story of the New York 1982 cold case was over. The ink had dried, the cell door had locked, and the city could finally sleep, knowing that the longest, darkest night in its modern fugitive history had finally, irrevocably met the dawn. The mechanical synchronization of a motor vehicles database in Southern California did not merely disrupt the comfortable retirement of an 81-year-old grandfather. It initiated a massive, cross-continental archaeological excavation into a 44-year-old network of structural deception that completely upended the historical archives of the New York City Police Department. For over 4 decades, the 1982 Greenwich Village disappearance had been categorized by generations of frustrated homicide investigators as a static tragedy, a singular, terrifying moment where a vibrant life was cleanly extracted from a locked apartment by a predator who subsequently vanished into thin air. But as the newly formed Joint Fugitive Recovery Task Force began a microscopic, digital audit of the suspects' financial records, real estate acquisitions, and historical domestic filings stretching from Manhattan to San Diego, they realized they were not dealing with a panicked individual who had spent half his life hiding in the dark underbelly of the criminal underworld. Instead, they were staring at the terrifying blueprint of a static nomad, a highly intelligent, sociopathic anomaly who had weaponized the administrative fragmentation of the pre-digital American West to construct a flawless, secondary existence built entirely on the stolen credentials of a deceased infant. Inside the high-security workspace of the Manhattan Cold Case Squad, the atmosphere turned from an immediate sense of celebratory triumph into a heavy, suffocating state of operational dread as detectives realized the true, monstrous dimensions of the case were only beginning to surface. The boxes of yellowed 1982 files, once resting in the damp basements of the precinct, were brought up into a modern war room where banks of high-definition monitors stood in stark contrast to the vintage, carbon copy paper reports. Forensic analysts, handwriting experts, and digital archaeologists worked in overlapping 12-hour shifts, using optical character recognition software to digitize every field interview card, every anonymous tip, and every localized surveillance log compiled during the initial winter dragnet. What they discovered within those long-forgotten pages was a deeply troubling pattern of missed connections and institutional blind spots. On 3 separate occasions in the mid-1980s, while the suspect was actively establishing his commercial real estate empire under his false identity in California, his newly corporate entities had interacted with financial institutions that maintained direct pipelines to New York City, but because the banking system of that era relied on localized, paper-driven auditing, these ominous red flags remained completely invisible to the homicide detectives chasing ghosts in Greenwich Village. The public exposure of the suspect's double life triggered an unyielding, high-velocity media frenzy that put the quiet coastal community in Southern California under a blinding national spotlight, completely eroding the local town's sense of historic security. Investigative journalists, independent podcasters, and national true crime networks descended upon the pristine suburban avenues like a flock of vultures, setting up their satellite dishes and camera tripods directly outside the suspect's luxury estate and the local municipal buildings where he had once served as a respected philanthropist. They interviewed former business partners, neighbors who had shared casual conversations over manicured lawns, and local politicians who had accepted his substantial charitable donations, forcing an entire community to look back at 40 years of shared memories through a retroactively applied lens of pure horror. People who had invited the grandfatherly figure into their homes, sat next to him at charity galas, and trusted him around their children found themselves consumed by a sickening sense of violation, realizing that the gentle, polite mask they had trusted for decades was a highly calculated shield designed to conceal a cold-blooded executioner. For the surviving siblings of the 1982 victim, this sudden explosion of national media attention was a deeply painful, exhausting secondary violation that turned their private, multi-generational grief into a commercialized true crime spectacle. They had spent 44 years praying for a definitive answer, carrying the heavy, silent burden of their sister's unresolved fate through decades of institutional indifference and false leads, but they had never anticipated that the truth would arrive wrapped in the cheap, sensationalized packaging of a primetime television special. The family actively resisted the constant overtures from Hollywood producers and sensationalist authors who sought to capitalize on the dramatic juxtaposition of the New York murder and the California double life, choosing instead to channel their immense emotional exhaustion into working directly with the task force's victim advocate units. They understood that the true, unyielding closure they craved could not be found in public notoriety or a glossy documentary series, but in the sterile, unblinking arena of a court of law where the suspect would finally be stripped of his performative virtue and forced to answer for his crimes. The logistical complexity of building an ironclad prosecution for a 44-year-old crime presented unprecedented legal challenges for the New York County District Attorney's Office, as the vast majority of the original physical evidence had suffered decades of environmental degradation within the precinct storage lockers. Forensic technicians at the medical examiner's lab worked under pristine, sterile conditions to extract touch DNA profiles from the vintage items recovered from the Greenwich Village apartment in 1982, items like the half-empty coffee cup, the open book, and the door handles that had been preserved in traditional paper evidence bags. Using advanced next-generation sequencing techniques that were entirely unimaginable to the investigators who first walked the crime scene, scientists managed to isolate a microscopic, highly robust genetic profile from the binding of the victim's personal address book, a profile that matched with mathematical certainty the DNA sample obtained from the suspect during his high-profile arrest in California. This scientific breakthrough provided the prosecution with its definitive, unassailable physical anchor, proving that despite the passage of nearly half a century and the creation of a completely new identity, the suspect's physical presence was indelibly stamped onto the landscape of the tragedy. The defense team representing the elderly fugitive launched an immediate, aggressive legal counteroffensive aimed at suppressing the facial recognition data and the subsequent DNA matches, filing a massive barrage of motions in both state and federal courts to block his extradition to New York. They argued passionately that their client was a frail, 81-year-old man suffering from age-related cardiovascular decline and early-stage cognitive impairment, rendering him physically and mentally incapable of assisting in his own defense or enduring a lengthy, high-stress criminal trial thousands of miles from his medical support network. They attempted to frame the prosecution as an unconstitutional, performative exercise in historical vengeance, claiming that the extreme delay in bringing charges had fundamentally violated the suspect's right to a speedy trial and had resulted in the permanent loss of critical exculpatory witnesses who could have verified his historical alibis. But the prosecution held their ground with an ironclad, unyielding resolve, presenting the court with definitive proof that the delay was a direct, calculated result of the suspect's extensive, fraudulent flight from justice, a continuous act of criminal deception that legally told the statute of limitations and stripped him of any right to claim administrative leniency. The legal battle reached a critical, highly dramatic bottleneck inside a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, where the judge had to determine whether the suspect's medical condition was severe enough to block his physical transfer to the jurisdiction of New York. The suspect sat in a wheelchair at the defense table, looking significantly smaller, more fragile, and far less formidable than he had in the vibrant photographs of his West Coast philanthropic life, his eyes cast downward in a calculated display of elderly vulnerability designed to evoke the sympathy of the bench. But when the prosecutor played a highly confidential surveillance video recorded by FBI agents just days before the arrest, a video showing the old man confidently navigating a real estate development site, shouting instructions to construction crews, and demonstrating a sharp, unyielding mental acuity, the illusion of physical and cognitive helplessness completely unraveled. The federal judge denied the defense's emergency stay with a blistering oral opinion, stating that the suspect's physical health was entirely sufficient to face the music in Manhattan, and ordered that he be immediately transferred under armed federal escort to the custody of the New York Police Department. The arrival of the suspect at the high-security detention facility in downtown Manhattan marked a historic, full-circle moment for the New York legal system, drawing a massive crowd of citizens, retired law enforcement officers, and international journalists to the streets surrounding the courthouse. The public remained transfixed by the sheer, historical scope of the arraignment, viewing the old man's return to the city of his youth not merely as a standard criminal proceeding, but as a profound, symbolic declaration that time itself cannot dilute the unyielding march of human justice. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was heavy, suffocating, and charged with an electric current of collective indignation as the clerk read aloud the original 1982 indictment, the archaic legal language sounding like a haunting, resonant voice echoing out from a completely different era of the city's history. The suspect pleaded not guilty through his high-priced legal team, his face remaining a blank, stony mask that refused to show a single trace of remorse or fear, still clinging to the arrogant delusion that his wealth and his decades of social respectability would protect him from the final consequences of his actions. The prosecution's opening statement when the trial finally commenced was a masterclass in narrative reconstruction, meticulously designed to transport the jury back through 44 years of cultural, economic, and technological change to the exact physical reality of that freezing November night in 1982. The lead assistant district attorney stood before the jury box with a large, black-and-white projection of the Greenwich Village street flashing on the screen behind her, walking the panel through the geography of the crime with a clinical, dondap, and highly visual precision. She described the trajectory of a calculated hunt, showing how the suspect had used his charm, his social connections, and his intellect to infiltrate the victim's life, mapping her routines with the cold, detached patience of a predator before stepping into her apartment to violently extinguish her future. The presentation seamlessly integrated the vintage paper documentation with the modern 3D forensic maps of the crime scene, creating an undeniable, terrifying visual bridge across nearly half a century of silence that left several members of the gallery weeping openly in the benches. The defense strategy centered entirely on a scorched earth campaign aimed at undermining the historical integrity of the New York Police Department's original investigation, dragging retired detectives onto the witness stand and subjecting them to a brutal, humiliating cross-examination regarding the primitive investigative techniques of 1982. They grilled the aging, gray-haired veterans for hours about the lack of immediate DNA collection protocols, the potential contamination of the fingerprint lift sheets, and the chaotic nature of the city's homicide records during a decade when Manhattan was plagued by historic levels of violent crime. The defense lawyers argued passionately to the jury that the state's case was built on a foundation of administrative assumptions, historical errors, and a desperate, modern reliance on an algorithm that had fundamentally mistaken an innocent man's face for that of a long-dead ghost. They attempted to portray the suspect's flight to California not as a flight from guilt, but as an ordinary, ambitious move by a young entrepreneur looking to escape the economic stagnation of a decaying New York City to build a respectable life in the sun. But the momentum of the trial shifted decisively and permanently back to the state when the prosecution called its chief forensic behavioral analyst to the stand, a specialist who had spent months conducting an exhausting, comprehensive audit of the suspect's private computer networks, personal diaries, and financial ledgers recovered from his California estate. The analyst revealed to a stunned courtroom that hidden inside a heavily encrypted digital folder disguised as historical real estate tax files sat an immaculate, meticulously curated archive of every single newspaper clipping, police update, and true crime blog post concerning the 1982 Greenwich Village disappearance published over the last 44 years. The suspect had not left his past behind in New York. He had carried it with him like a sacred, secret trophy, tracking the progress of the cold case unit with the intense, clinical focus of a general monitoring an enemy's movements, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that his double life was not a clean break from reality, but a continuous, calculated exercise in active evasion and psychological compartmentalization. The final closing arguments were a high-tension clash of legal and philosophical extremes, with the defense making a desperate, intellectual plea for the preservation of reasonable doubt against the overwhelming emotional tide of public indignation, while the prosecution demanded an unyielding, total validation of the sacred debt owed to the dead. The prosecutor did not utilize elaborate rhetorical flourishes. She simply stood before the jury box, pointed a finger directly at the old man sitting at the defense table, and placed a vintage 1982 photograph of the vibrant young victim directly next to the suspect's modern, smiling California driver's license on the display screen. She asked the 12 citizens to finally strip the monster of his stolen identity, to look past the wrinkles, the wealth, and the performative philanthropy of his West Coast existence, to see the cold-blooded executioner who had stolen a life and mocked the city's justice for 44 years. The jury's retirement to the deliberation room was accompanied by an absolute, heavy silence that settled over the entire Manhattan courthouse complex, a realization that a multi-generational ledger of horror was finally about to be definitively closed. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 5 hours, an exceptionally brief window for a case of such historic proportions and chronological complexity, indicating an absolute, unyielding consensus among the 12 citizens tasked with deciding the suspect's fate. When the court reconvened and the foreperson pronounced the word guilty on every single count of the indictment, a collective, audible gasp of raw emotion swept through the packed gallery, followed by the sound of quiet, exhausting weeping from the victim's surviving family members who sat huddled together in the front row. The suspect showed no visible reaction, his body remaining frozen in his chair, his dead, unblinking eyes fixed on the wooden table before him as the realization finally crashed through his remaining layers of arrogance that his double life had officially collapsed into a permanent concrete trap. The judge delivered a scathing, emotionally resonant sentencing address, telling the old man that his downfall was an act of absolute poetic justice, that the very modern technology he had ignored while building his real estate empire was the exact tool that the universe had used to pull his mask away and strip him of his remaining freedom. The sentence of maximum life imprisonment without the possibility of parole ensured that the elderly fugitive would spend the remaining days of his natural life within the sterile, high-security infrastructure of a New York State penitentiary, his name permanently scrubbed from the rolls of free men and his wealth liquidated to satisfy a massive victim restitution order. But as the steel doors of the detention facility closed behind him, the city of New York discovered that a verdict does not bring an immediate, cinematic explosion of joy. It brings a slow, solemn return of a peace that had been absent from the Greenwich Village neighborhood for 44 years. The dark historical cloud that had hung over that wood-paneled apartment building seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of cultural resolution that allowed the community to finally look back at the events of 1982 without the paralyzing grip of active suspicion or unresolved fear. The story of the static nomad who lived a double life became a permanent, foundational milestone in the archives of modern international law enforcement, a definitive proof that no matter how far fugitive runs, no matter how perfect the camouflage they construct, and no matter how many decades the darkness tries to protect the secret, the truth carries an undeniable, terrifying weight that will eventually break through the floorboards of time and drag the monster into the light. The structural disintegration of the suspect's West Coast empire in the immediate aftermath of the New York conviction did not merely close a historic file. It forced federal behavioral scientists to fundamentally dismantle the existing psychological models used to track long-term fugitives across North America. For nearly half a century, the conventional wisdom within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Fugitive Recovery National Matrix had maintained that an individual fleeing a capital murder charge would naturally drift toward the geographic periphery, seeking refuge within transient, low-income border towns or deep within the insular, anti-government communities of the Pacific Northwest. The New York 1982 predator, as exposed by the microscopic data mining of his California corporate accounts, had executed an entirely opposite strategy, a chilling method of hypervisible domestic integration that criminologists formally designated as affluent camouflage. He realized that the ultimate cloaking device in late 20th century America was not poverty, obscurity, or a remote cabin in the woods, but a high-end suburban zip code, a massive real estate portfolio, and a seat on the board of directors of a prominent local children's hospital. By transforming himself into a highly visible, deeply respected pillar of a wealthy Southern California enclave, he had successfully created an unassailable shield of social respectability that rendered him completely invisible to the local law enforcement agencies who routinely crossed his path. Inside the climate-controlled archives of the Joint Fugitive Recovery Task Force in downtown Manhattan, the focus of the active investigation abruptly shifted away from the completed 1982 trial and spiraled backward into a massive, multi-jurisdictional audit of the suspect's transient years between 1983 and 1988, the critical, unmapped window during which he was actively forging his secondary identity. A specialized team of identity theft specialists, forensic geneticists, and federal archivists was assembled in a secure room where the walls were quickly covered in a sweeping, labyrinthine map of the American Sun Belt, tracing every cash-in-hand real estate transaction, every fraudulent driver's license application, and every social security number variance linked to his early aliases. They discovered that his transition from a panicked Manhattan fugitive into a polished California millionaire was achieved through a calculated, cold-blooded exploitation of the systemic administrative blind spots that plagued the pre-digital United States vital statistics registries. He had spent years combing through historical cemetery records and old microfilm newspapers in rural Texas and Arizona, systematically searching for the identities of deceased infants whose birth years matched his own, stealing their names, their clean histories, and their American futures to build a corporate fortress that would withstand 40 years of law enforcement scrutiny. The public exposure of this structural identity forgery sent a profound wave of anxiety through the national banking and corporate real estate industries, triggering an aggressive, industry-wide reevaluation of legacy property deeds and historical commercial trusts across the West Coast. Financial institutions that had proudly featured the elderly philanthropist in their annual corporate reviews found themselves locked in a state of high-intensity legal panic, frantically launching internal audits to determine how a man utilizing the stolen Social Security credentials of a child who died in 1951 had managed to secure hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial credit, build major master plan communities, and sign legally binding contracts with state municipalities. The realization that the entire economic architecture of a prominent California development firm had been constructed on top of a foundation of historical identity theft and capital murder completely undermined the traditional assumptions of corporate due diligence, forcing state legislatures to rapidly draft strict new biometric verification protocols for all high-value corporate filings and property transfers. For the surviving family of the 1982 Manhattan victim, this secondary phase of the investigation brought a complex, exhausting mix of emotional validation and deep, existential exhaustion as they watched their private tragedy mutate into a sprawling national scandal concerning federal data synchronization and administrative vulnerability. The victim's younger brother, who had assumed the official leadership of the family's legal estate, used his sudden national media platform to aggressively lobby for the creation of a permanent, centralized federal registry explicitly designed to link historical infant death certificates with active motor vehicle databases across all 50 states. He refused to allow his sister's memory to be relegated to a sensationalized footnote in a true crime documentary about a clever fugitive, choosing instead to channel his immense grief into a relentless, highly organized political campaign that sought to ensure that no future killer could ever use the administrative isolation of a state line to bury a capital crime and purchase a second life in the sun. Meanwhile, the deep scanning digital audits conducted by the task force's forensic data specialists began to uncover a series of terrifying, anomalous geographic coincidences buried deep within the suspect's early travel records from the summer of 1985, a period during which he was actively operating under the stolen identity of a deceased infant while traveling extensively through the interstate corridors of New Mexico and West Texas. Cross-referencing his vintage corporate fuel receipts, cash advance ledgers, and car rental agreements with the national database of unsolved historical homicides, the computer algorithms flagged a striking, mathematically devastating correlation with a string of unresolved missing persons files along Route 66. Cases involving young out-of-state tourists who had vanished entirely from highway rest stops and budget motels during that exact same timeline. The discovery that the static nomad's flight from Manhattan might have involved a secondary, cross-country trail of violence shattered the localized boundaries of the New York file once again, forcing the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program to rapidly coordinate a multi-state homicide task force to systematically audit every month of the killer's life on the run. The physical reality of this interstate hunting itinerary became undeniable when a specialized team of desert search and recovery specialists, guided by the newly decrypted financial coordinates and the specific geographic descriptions found within a collection of vintage, handwritten real estate ledger notebooks recovered from his California estate, deployed to an isolated, windswept canyon outside of Gallup, New Mexico. The environment was an absolute, stark contrast to the frozen streets of Manhattan or the manicured lawns of Southern California. Here, under a blinding, merciless desert sun, the forensic team moved their ground-penetrating radar units over a parched, iron-heavy clay that had remained largely undisturbed since the mid-1980s. The desert, like a pristine archive, possesses an incredible clinical capacity for preservation, its extreme heat and lack of moisture capable of halting the natural processes of decay and freezing physical evidence in time for generations. On the third morning of the systematic sweep, the radar equipment registered a distinct subsurface structural anomaly located directly beneath the rotted floorboards of a long-abandoned, pre-war tourist cabin, an anomaly that perfectly mirrored the precise dimensions of a shallow, clandestine burial site. As the forensic anthropologists carefully removed the layers of dry, rock-hard topsoil, their soft brushes and dental picks meticulously clearing away 40 years of desert dust, the site surrendered a heartbreaking, unassailable treasury of historical truth that instantly closed a landmark 1985 New Mexico missing persons investigation. The team uncovered a collection of vintage personal items, a distinctive silver Southwestern bracelet, a pair of classic aviator sunglasses, and a leather wallet containing the identification cards of a young college student who had vanished entirely while on a cross-country road trip. The discovery sent a powerful physical shock through the entire national law enforcement community, providing the definitive, horrific proof that the New York 1982 cold case was merely the opening chapter in a much larger, multi-state anthology of blood, and that the suspect's flight from justice had served as a catalyst for a silent career of opportunistic violence across the empty expanses of the American West. Back in New York, the media coverage of these escalating Southwestern discoveries took on an intensely somber, almost reverent tone, with nightly broadcasts tracking the progress of the desert excavations like a long, painful march toward national collective reckoning. The anchor of that original headline, "The fugitive living a double life finally caught," remained the central pivot around which the entire concept of historical criminal accountability was being radically redefined in the public consciousness, proving that the passage of 40 years was no longer an absolute shield against the relentless march of modern science. Inside the maximum security prison ward where the 81-year-old convict was serving his sentence, the atmosphere turned increasingly claustrophobic as teams of federal homicide detectives arrived daily at his bedside, armed with the newly recovered desert evidence, demanding that he finally strip away his remaining layers of denial and provide the names of any other citizens he had buried along his historical escape routes before his own biological clock ran out of time. But the aging predator remained entirely unrepentant, utilizing his failing physical health and his remaining secrets as his final piece of transactional currency, a weapon to torment the authorities and maintain a sense of absolute psychological control over the living until his very last breath. He would sit in his prison infirmary bed, staring at the high-definition photographs of the New Mexico Canyon with a cold, detached indifference, occasionally dropping a cryptic, mocking hint about a highway marker or a forgotten motel name from 1986, only to fall completely silent the moment investigators pressed for exact coordinates or identities. He took a distinct, narcissistic delight in watching the desperate frustration of the veteran detective sitting across from him, proving that even behind bars, completely stripped of his wealth, his prestige, and his corporate empire, he still possessed the same predatory desire to dominate, manipulate, and hold entire families hostage through the power of his silence. In the quiet, cool twilight of the Greenwich Village street where the nightmare had originally taken root 44 years prior, the residential block stood as a peaceful, resilient monument to the enduring survival of the human spirit over the calculated darkness of the past. The apartment complex where the young professional's life had been violently interrupted had undergone decades of tenants, renovations, and structural changes, but the memory of that fateful winter night in 1982 had remained an indelible part of the building's historic identity. Neighbors who had lived on the street for generations, those who remembered the frantic initial search and the long decades of absolute BTAC, would occasionally look up at the flickering street lamps, feeling a solemn, profound sense of resolution that the ghost which had haunted their community for a generation had finally been called by his true name and forced into the light of justice. The story was no longer a cautionary tale about a monster who got away. It had transformed into a definitive proof that the moral arc of the universe is long, and that it bends inexorably toward accountability, no matter how deep the shadows where the secret is kept. As the multi-state task force prepared to organize its final, archived reports for permanent inclusion within the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the advanced digital imaging teams at the federal labs completed a total, high-resolution reconstruction of the physical journals and personal diaries recovered from the suspect's California estate. Hidden within the microscopic texture of the very last page of a 1989 real estate ledger, the laser scanning technology uncovered a faint, overlapping series of indentations, impressions left behind by the heavy pressure of a pen from a sheet of paper that had been violently torn out and destroyed long before the suspect's arrest. Using advanced multispectral lighting and side-angle shadow enhancement, forensic technicians managed to reconstruct a single, handwritten sentence executed in the suspect's distinct, tight penmanship, a sentence that sent a cold shock of adrenaline through the remaining members of the cold case squad. The Foundation in Palm Springs holds the rest of the ledger. This final, cryptic clue threatened to blow the historical investigation wide open once again, pointing directly toward one of the suspect's earliest and largest commercial construction projects in the California desert, a massive residential resort development completed in the winter of 1990. The implication was a terrifying reminder that the closing of a single courtroom trial is rarely the absolute end of a serial predator's narrative, but as the specialized task force prepared to coordinate with structural engineers and ground radar technicians to execute a targeted excavation of the desert resort's foundation, they did so with the quiet, unbreakable confidence of a system that had already proven that no wall is thick enough, no concrete is dense enough, and no lie is old enough to withstand the unyielding, patient pressure of persistent justice. The longest night in the city's fugitive history had officially met the dawn. The masks had been shattered, the double lives had been dissolved, and the memory of the young soul who had vanished into the New York rains so long ago was finally, irrevocably allowed to achieve a state of eternal, dignified rest under the wide, open canopy of the changing sky. The cryptic, handwritten phrase dragged into the light by the Federal Laboratory's multispectral lasers. The Foundation in Palm Springs holds the rest of the ledger, acted like an explosive charge detonated beneath the already fractured remains of the suspect's 44-year-old double life. For decades, the legal victory in Manhattan had been framed as a precise, modern triumph over a historical anomaly, a clean resolution that systematically dismantled the sophisticated camouflage of an elderly California philanthropist. But those 10 chilling words, physically pressed into the structural fibers of a 1989 real estate ledger before being violently ripped away, shattered any lingering illusions of a finalized narrative. The implication hit the Joint Fugitive Recovery Task Force with the force of a physical blow. The 1982 Greenwich Village homicide and the subsequent 1985 New Mexico desert recovery were not isolated landmarks of a fugitive's panic, but merely the visible coordinates of a vast, cross-continental blueprint of violence that had been literally poured into the concrete foundations of the suspect's early West Coast real estate empire. Inside the high-security technical workspace of the Manhattan Cold Case Squad, the atmosphere grew suffocatingly tense as structural engineers, architectural historians, and remote sensing analysts from the United States Geological Survey were integrated into the core investigative team. They were no longer analyzing paper transit logs or faded microfilmed mugshots from 1982. They were staring at high-definition blueprints, structural pouring schedules, and historical corporate tax documents relating to the construction of a massive luxury residential resort in Palm Springs, California, completed in the winter of 1990. The data tracking revealed a terrifying, logistical reality. During the exact months when the suspect was using his stolen infant identity to secure millions of dollars in commercial development bonds, he had personally overseen the excavation, grading, and concrete installation of the resort's sprawling subterranean utility networks. For hours, forensic engineers cross-referenced the corporate payroll logs with old weather radar patterns from 1990, searching for the precise, unmonitored windows where the suspect could have utilized heavy excavation machinery in the dead of night, transforming a multi-million-dollar commercial playground into a permanent, concrete-shrouded vault of death. The public disclosure of this secondary, hidden architectural archive triggered an immediate, high-stakes crisis within the luxury hospitality and high-end real estate sectors of Southern California, completely paralyzing the local economy of the wealthy desert oasis. The resort in Palm Springs, long considered a premier destination for international tourists, celebrities, and corporate retreats, found itself suddenly surrounded by unmarked federal law enforcement vehicles, tactical search units, and mobile ground-penetrating radar arrays. The visual contrast was jarring and surreal. Wealthy guests checking out of luxury suites in the bright desert sunlight while teams of pale, hyper-focused crime scene technicians dressed in sterile white hazmat suits unloaded heavy concrete coring drills, ground radar arrays, and canine search units directly onto the manicured resort grounds. The local media networks descended upon the perimeter like a swarm of locusts, launching 24-hour live feeds with sensationalized banners that forced the entire West Coast community to confront the agonizing reality that their playground of prosperity had been constructed directly on top of a hidden historical cemetery. For the management and corporate shareholders of the multi-state real estate development trust that had purchased the suspect's former corporate assets, the ongoing forensic invasion was an absolute financial and legal catastrophe. They scrambled to launch their own desperate counteraudits, hiring independent structural experts to argue that any active drilling or subsurface excavation beneath the resort's main load-bearing foundations would permanently compromise the building's structural integrity, causing millions of dollars in property damage and creating an immediate public safety hazard. But the federal prosecutors from the Southern District of New York remained entirely unyielding, armed with a sweeping, historic search warrant issued under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that granted them total, unrestricted authority to breach any structure, wall, or foundation linked to the suspect's historical corporate timeline. The law enforcement apparatus was sending a definitive, uncompromising message to the corporate world. No amount of wealth, no commercial real estate evaluation, and no physical barrier of concrete or steel would ever be allowed to serve as a permanent asylum for a serial killer's sins. The physical mobilization inside the subterranean utility corridors of the Palm Springs resort was a grueling, claustrophobic operation that tested the absolute limits of modern forensic archaeology. Working in temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees within the narrow, concrete-walled mechanical tunnels beneath the resort, search teams slowly moved their high-frequency ground-penetrating radar units over every square inch of the industrial flooring. The desert earth beneath the concrete, compressed by 36 years of structural weight and baking heat, presented a highly dense, iron-heavy composition that severely distorted standard radar signals, requiring the technical engineers to constantly recalibrate their digital equipment node by node. For 4 consecutive days, the search yielded nothing but structural steel reinforcements, plumbing conduits, and empty pockets of desert sand, a frustrating deadlock that began to draw intense criticism from corporate lawyers and skeptical administrative bureaucrats who claimed the task force was chasing the fictional, mad musings of an old man's diary. But the momentum shifted decisively and permanently on the 5th night of the subterranean sweep, when a specialized deep-scanning radar array developed by the military for detecting underground bunker complexes flagged a massive, highly anomalous structural variance located deep beneath the main foundation block of the resort's private executive spa wing. The digital projection revealed a highly distinct geometric disturbance in the natural soil layers beneath 5 feet of reinforced industrial concrete, a subsurface void that did not correspond to any known plumbing, electrical, or structural blueprint in the resort's official building files. The forensic team knew instantly that they were looking at the exact physical manifest of the sentence recovered from the ledger. The primary killer had deliberately created an unmapped, subterranean vault during the initial concrete pour of 1990, utilizing his absolute corporate authority over the construction site to ensure that whatever was placed inside that void would remain completely sealed from the living world for generations. The execution of the excavation required a high-precision, surgical operation, with structural technicians using heavy-duty diamond saw cutters to carefully slice through the thick layers of reinforced concrete without triggering a catastrophic shift in the load-bearing columns above. The sound of the saws cutting through stone filled the dark mechanical tunnels with a deafening, metallic shriek, kicking up dense clouds of fine concrete dust that left the forensic team breathing through specialized respirators under the glare of temporary industrial floodlights. When the final block of severed concrete was carefully lifted away using a specialized hydraulic hoist, it revealed a heavy, industrial plastic sheet that had been treated with commercial-grade sealing tar, a highly effective waterproofing barrier designed to protect the contents of the void from the extreme heat and shifting moisture of the surrounding desert soil. As the forensic anthropologists carefully slit through the thick, tar-coated plastic layers, their hands trembling slightly under their latex gloves, the subterranean vault finally surrendered a collection of historical horrors that completely rewrote the true dimensions of the suspect's life on the run. Hidden inside the void sat a large, commercial-grade contractor's footlocker containing the definitive, unshredded personal archives of the static nomad's hidden existence, not cash, gold, or weapons, but an immaculate, meticulously organized treasury of death. The footlocker contained the original, vintage New York driver's licenses, social security cards, and personal photographs of 4 different young individuals who had vanished entirely from the tri-state area and the West Coast between 1983 and 1989. Individuals whose files had spent decades gathering dust in the cold case cabinets of multiple completely unconnected police departments. The discovery sent a powerful, devastating shock of finality and revulsion through the national law enforcement community, providing the absolute, unassailable physical proof that the suspect's flight from the 1982 Greenwich Village homicide had served as the genesis for a highly organized, cross-country career of opportunistic violence that exploited the total lack of administrative data sharing in late 20th century America. Alongside the personal identification cards sat a series of meticulously compiled, handwritten field journals executed in the suspect's distinct, tight penmanship, the actual physical ledger referenced in the torn-out notebook page. These journals contained the precise chronological dates, transit times, geographic coordinates, and behavioral observations relating to every single extraction he had executed over a 7-year timeline, proving that he viewed his crimes not with a sense of panicked guilt or moral hesitation, but as a series of highly successful, intellectual milestones that he had deliberately preserved as a private monument to his own absolute supremacy over the law. Back in New York City, the public reaction to the Palm Springs discovery was a complex, heavy mix of profound cultural trauma and overwhelming indignation as the media networks launched continuous, primetime retrospectives that analyzed the names and faces of the newly identified victims. The original headline, New York 1982 Cold Case Solved, Fugitive Living Double Life Finally Caught, took on a massive, terrifyingly historic dimension in the public consciousness, viewed no longer as a singular lucky break in an isolated, 40-year-old investigation, but as the master key that had systematically unlocked one of the most extensive, undetected criminal conspiracies in the history of modern American law enforcement. The national news anchors stood outside the Greenwich Village apartment building where the nightmare had originally begun so long ago, their voices somber as they explained to viewers that the light of modern forensic science had finally pierced through 3 decades of darkness to reclaim the lost histories of the forgotten. The legal and administrative machinery of the federal justice system moved with an ironclad, rapid precision to integrate the newly recovered evidence into a massive, secondary federal indictment against the 81-year-old convict, ensuring that his surviving family members and former corporate associates would be stripped of any remaining legal options to contest the total liquidation of his West Coast estate. The state of California launched a sweeping, independent investigation into the historical oversight practices of its own Department of Motor Vehicles and Corporate Registration Services, utilizing the specific methodology of the suspect's identity forgery to implement strict, automated security patches across all modern administrative databases. The case had transformed into a national catalyst for systemic reform, a historical blueprint that forced the entire country to recognize that the administrative fragmentation of the past was a permanent vulnerability that required a total, unified digital defense to protect the living. Inside the sterile, concrete-walled prison hospital ward in upstate New York, where the elderly predator was serving his maximum life sentence, the atmosphere turned into a psychological battlefield as federal prosecutors arrived with copies of the newly recovered field journals, forcing him to look at his own meticulous handwriting under the unblinking glare of the facility's security cameras. The old man's grandfatherly facade had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, sweating desperation as he realized that his own compulsive desire to preserve the memories of his crimes, the exact trait that had provided him with a sense of absolute control over the decades, had served as the definitive tool of his complete and total undoing. He could no longer hide behind his false identity, his performative philanthropy, or his status as a loving family man. His own words, written in the dark corners of his past and buried deep beneath 5 feet of reinforced concrete, had systematically stripped away his armor of denial, leaving him to face the absolute certainty of dying in anonymity within the punitive infrastructure of the state. The final resting places of the newly identified victims were eventually marked by a series of beautiful, matching stone monuments funded entirely by the liquidated proceeds of the suspect's real estate empire, their dedications attended by a massive network of surviving family members, retired homicide detectives, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by the historic scope of the investigation. The monuments stood as a permanent, physical declaration that the narrative of their lives had finally been rescued from the crushing silence of the past, shifting their memories out of the realm of unresolved urban legends and into the sacred sanctuary of eternal, dignified remembrance. The family of the 1982 Greenwich Village victim stood alongside the other families in a powerful show of cross-continental solidarity, their collective tears falling onto the earth as they realized that their 44-year journey through the darkness had finally delivered a total, unyielding close to the nightmare that had frozen their hearts for a generation. In the quiet, cool twilight of the Palm Springs resort, where the mechanical drills had finally gone silent and the structural excavations had been permanently backfilled with clean desert sand, a profound, solemn peace settled over the manicured property. The executive spa wing was completely remodeled by the corporate ownership group, its subterranean tunnels permanently sealed and the ground above transformed into a quiet, native desert reflection garden filled with blooming sage, white stone paths, and a single, understated bronze plaque that bore only the names of the individuals whose histories had been reclaimed from the void below. The resort guests who walked the paths in the evening air did so with a renewed sense of reverence and collective memory, understanding that the space had been permanently transformed from a monument of hidden terror into a sanctuary of absolute truth. The story of the static nomad who lived a double life had reached its ultimate, definitive completion, its codes decrypted, its vaults breached, its journals laid bare before the world, and its vast cross-country ledger of horror permanently, irrevocably balanced under the wide, open canopy of the changing sky. The city of New York, the desert enclaves of California, and the empty expanses of the American West could finally sleep in absolute safety, knowing that the longest, darkest night in their shared fugitive history had finally met the absolute dawn, leaving behind an enduring, unassailable legacy of forensic persistence, institutional memory, and the unyielding, patient power of the truth. The transition of the Palm Springs discovery from an active forensic excavation into a definitive baseline for historical behavioral profile models did nothing to ease the quiet panic that had paralyzed the institutional core of West Coast law enforcement. The recovery of the contractor's footlocker from beneath 5 feet of reinforced industrial concrete proved that the New York 1982 cold case was not a localized anomaly of survival, but the structural foundation of a multi-state predatory timeline that had systematically exploited the administrative blindness of the pre-digital American West. Criminologists within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit formally classified the suspect's methodology as structural entombment, an advanced level of sociopathic planning where a predator utilizes their professional authority over multi-million-dollar civil engineering projects to pour their sins directly into the physical geography of a changing nation. The case became the central, mandatory curriculum for every homicide command school in North America, a chilling warning that the traditional investigation techniques designed to track erratic, marginalized fugitives were completely useless against a highly intelligent static nomad who used the glittering economic expansion of the Sun Belt as his personal camouflage network. Inside the climate-controlled vaults of the Federal Records Repository, a specialized data task force began a line-by-line digital dissection of the newly recovered handwritten field journals, translating 36 years of meticulous penmanship into a dynamic behavioral matrix. The analysts weren't merely archiving the names and transit coordinates recorded within the pages. They were using advanced predictive algorithms to study the psychological intervals between his civic donations in California and his predatory extractions across the Southwest. What they uncovered was a terrifying pattern of emotional decompression, the suspect's most significant acts of performative philanthropy. The weeks where he was photographed handing oversized checks to children's charities or organizing neighborhood beautification fundraisers occurred in the immediate, high-stress aftermath of his clandestine expeditions. The grandfatherly mask he wore so comfortably in Southern California was not a stressful facade that required immense psychological energy to maintain. It was his sanctuary, a highly calculated anchor that allowed him to restabilize his public ego while keeping his actual, blood-drenched history completely buried beneath the feet of the people who trusted him. The economic and legal fallout from the subterranean discovery continued to tear through the regional real estate and commercial banking sectors of the West Coast, triggering a massive, unprecedented wave of corporate anxiety over legacy title deeds and historical land acquisitions. Major title insurance corporations and private equity firms found themselves facing catastrophic liability risks as independent legal audits revealed that dozens of high-value commercial properties, residential developments, and municipal utility corridors built by the suspect's firm between 1985 and 1995 were constructed utilizing corporate entities tied directly to the stolen identity of the deceased infant. The state legislatures of California, Arizona, and New Mexico were forced to convene emergency committees to draft comprehensive administrative patches, creating biometric verification standards for all historical property recordings to prevent the legal architecture of the state from being weaponized by long-term fugitives. The traditional reliance on paper corporate references and localized credit checks was permanently shattered, replaced by an aggressive, digital-first auditing culture that understood that a pristine corporate ledger could easily serve as the ultimate cloaking device for a capital murderer. For the surviving family of the 1982 Manhattan victim, the slow, mechanical progression of the secondary federal investigations brought a profound, exhausting transition from acute grief into a state of solemn, political determination. The sibling who had stood on the courthouse steps in New York refused every predatory offer from international streaming platforms and high-profile true crime publishers who sought to turn the horrific discovery of the Palm Springs Vault into a commercialized entertainment franchise. They understood that the true, unyielding monument to their sister's memory was not a sensationalized television series, but the relentless operation of the National Forensic Advocacy Group they had established during the darkest decades of the BTAC. The coalition directed their substantial private endowments directly into funding independent, high-frequency ground-penetrating radar sweeps for struggling rural sheriff's departments across the Southwest, ensuring that the forensic momentum generated by the recovery of the contractor's footlocker would never be halted by local budgetary constraints or institutional fatigue. Meanwhile, The deep scanning analytical work conducted on the suspect's early financial archives began to flag a series of highly anomalies, long-forgotten credit transactions from the winter of 1987, a period during which the static nomad was expanding his construction footprint into the mountain communities of northern Arizona. The computer models detected a repetitive, mathematical sequence of cash advance withdrawals and equipment rental fees from a defunct hardware supplier along the perimeter of the Navajo Nation, a region that had been plagued by a string of unresolved historical disappearances involving seasonal hikers and out-of-state tourists during the late 20th century. This geographic alignment acted like a sudden current surging through a cold circuit, forcing the multi-jurisdictional task force to rapidly redeploy its mobile forensic assets away from the desert resorts of Palm Springs and deep into the rugged, high-altitude canyons of the Colorado Plateau, as the entire nation watched the true, monstrous dimensions of the old man's double life continue to expand long after his conviction. The physical reality of this northern Arizona timeline became concrete when a specialized team of high-altitude search specialists, guided by the precise topographic annotations discovered within the third chapter of the recovered field journals, focused their efforts on a long-abandoned timber logging flume near the edge of a deep mountain gorge. The environmental conditions were a brutal, freezing contrast to the sweltering tunnels of the desert resort. Here, under a heavy canopy of ponderosa pines and a biting mountain wind, forensic anthropologists moved their ground-penetrating radar units over a rocky, uneven terrain that had been frozen by decades of intense winter snowpacks. The mountain earth, characterized by dense basalt rock and thick layers of decaying pine needles, possessed a highly specific preservation matrix, its freezing temperatures capable of halting organic degradation and locking physical evidence in a sterile, chronological vacuum for half a century. On the fourth morning of the systematic grid sweep, the radar array registered a distinct subsurface structural disturbance hidden beneath the rotted timber supports of the historical logging flume, an anomaly that perfectly matched the precise parameters of an opportunistic wilderness burial site. As the recovery technicians carefully cleared away the layers of rock and compacted pine earth, their soft brushes and dental picks systematically exposing the deep-seated secrets of the canyon floor, the site surrendered a heartbreaking treasury of historical truth that instantly closed two landmark Arizona cold cases from 1987. The team uncovered the highly preserved personal effects, winter clothing fragments, and skeletal remains of two young students who had vanished entirely while on a weekend hiking trip through the national forests, individuals whose names had spent nearly 4 decades as agonizing question marks on the missing persons bulletin boards of the Southwest. The discoveries sent a massive wave of somber validation through the national law enforcement community, providing the ultimate, unassailable physical proof that the suspect's flight from Manhattan had transformed him into an apex predator who utilized the vast, unmonitored wilderness of the American West to execute a silent career of calculated violence while simultaneously building an empire of middle-class respectability in the suburbs. Back in New York City, the media coverage of the northern Arizona recoveries took on an intensely reverent, quasi-religious tone, with nightly news broadcasts tracking the progress of the canyon excavations like a long, painful march toward a complete national collective healing. The anchor of that original headline, the notebook found in the attic, the fugitive living a double life finally caught, remained the central pivot around which the entire concept of historical justice was being radically redefined in the public consciousness, demonstrating to every aging fugitive still harboring a dark secret that time is not an absolute defense against the relentless evolution of modern forensic science. Inside the high-security medical wing of the state penitentiary where the 81-year-old convict was serving his sentence, the atmosphere turned into an absolute psychological fortress as federal prosecutors arrived daily at his bedside, forcing him to look at the high-definition photographs of the Arizona canyon floor under the unblinking glare of the facility's surveillance cameras. The suspect's grandfatherly exterior had completely vanished, replaced by a raw, sweating desperation as he realized that his own compulsive desire to record the precise details of his crimes, the exact trait that had granted him a sense of absolute control over his victims for decades, had served as the definitive engine of his complete and total public destruction. He could no longer hide behind his wealth, his corporate connections, or his performative status as a loving patriarch. His own words, written in the dark corners of his past and buried deep beneath the concrete of his developments and the soil of the canyons, had systematically stripped away his remaining layers of denial, leaving him to face the absolute certainty of dying in total anonymity within the punitive machinery of the state. He fought a losing battle against his own biological clock, his heart failing under the immense psychological weight of his complete exposure, yet he remained stubbornly silent during his final hours, refusing to grant the satisfaction of a verbal confession to the detectives who sat across from his bed, viewing his closed lips as his final, petty act of defiance against the living. When the news finally broke that the suspect had passed away in his prison cell from acute cardiovascular failure, the reaction across Manhattan and the wider West Coast was not one of anger, but of a profound, collective exhaustion that marked the absolute, definitive end of an era of unchecked mystery. The man who had haunted the institutional memory of New York for 44 years was gone, taking whatever unmapped secrets remained within his mind to an unmarked prison grave, leaving behind a monumental legacy of forensic breakthroughs that would forever alter the structure of modern fugitive recovery. The multi-agency task force was eventually dissolved, its digital systems archived, and the police museum where the original leather notebook was kept became a quiet place of intensive study for future criminal justice students who wanted to understand the terrifying complexity of sociopathic camouflage. The story did not end with a neat, cinematic resolution. It dissolved into a collection of historical fragments, a puzzle with missing pieces that would forever remind the city of the fragility of suburban peace and the enduring, terrifying weight of human malice. Yet, in the quiet Greenwich Village neighborhood where the nightmare had originally taken root so long ago, the silence that now exists is no longer a hiding place for fear or suspicion. It is a space where the living can finally remember the dead without the paralyzing grip of active trauma, their names spoken aloud with honor and love under the wide canopy of the changing sky. The transformation of the residential block from a site of historic horror into a space of ordinary urban rhythm was the community's ultimate victory over the legacy of the static nomad, a definitive declaration that the final, lasting chapter of that street would belong to resilience, safety, and peace. The file was officially stamped complete, the legal loops were closed, the cell door had locked for the final time, and the city could finally move forward into the future, its collective conscience clear and its historical ledger balanced under the wide, open sky. The biological cessation of the aging predator within his upstate New York infirmary cell did not halt the expanding machinery of the cross-continental task force. Instead, it acted as a chilling operational release, freeing investigators from the tactical constraints of a living prosecution and allowing them to conduct an uninhibited, forensic postmortem of an entire generation of administrative data. When a static nomad dies with unmapped secrets still embedded in the historical topography of his corporate empire, he commits a final, passive act of violence against the living, leaving dozens of families stranded in a permanent state of unresolved suspension. But the recovery of the contractor's footlocker in Palm Springs and the subsequent decryption of the Northern Arizona field journals had provided the Joint Fugitive Recovery Task Force with a highly precise, mathematical roadmap of malice, a repository of chronological dates, corporate fuel stops, and localized concrete pouring schedules that continued to generate active investigative leads long after the killer's heart had stopped beating. Inside the high-security technical command center of the Manhattan Cold Case Squad, the atmosphere turned from a retrospective analysis of a singular fugitive's life into a sweeping, structural audit of the systemic vulnerabilities that had plagued the pre-digital American banking and land titling systems. A specialized team of forensic economists, title archaeologists, and federal asset recovery specialists worked in overlapping 12-hour shifts, using high-powered server networks to map out every single commercial shell company, dummy corporation, and blind trust established by the suspect between 1985 and 1995. What they uncovered beneath those decades of corporate paperwork was a highly sophisticated, cross-border financial matrix designed to do far more than just hide real estate profits from the Internal Revenue Service. It was a structural camouflage framework that allowed the suspect to move hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash across state lines under the guise of ordinary construction logistics, ensuring that his predatory itineraries were completely funded and protected by the very corporate institutions that celebrated him as a visionary developer. The public exposure of this multi-million-dollar economic shield sent a fresh wave of panic and indignation through the local communities of Southern California and Arizona, completely eroding the fragile sense of cultural closure that had slowly begun to return following the primary conviction. Citizens who had spent their lives purchasing homes, raising families, and building small businesses within the master plan developments constructed by the suspect's firm were forced to confront the sickening reality that the literal foundations of their neighborhoods had been financed, graded, and poured by a capital murderer who used the expansion of the Sun Belt to bury his sins. The local real estate markets suffered immediate, chaotic disruptions as title insurance companies scrambled to issue emergency riders on historical property deeds, terrified by the prospect that secondary forensic excavations might reveal further structural vaults hidden beneath the residential cul-de-sacs, converting pristine suburban dream homes into active, high-visibility homicide scenes under the unblinking glare of national media networks. For the National Forensic Advocacy Group founded by the 1982 Manhattan victim's family, the death of the killer served as a catalyst for an aggressive expansion of their technological and political footprint, transforming their citizen-led coalition into an agile, non-profit intelligence agency that operated completely independent of state-funded law enforcement constraints. Utilizing a massive influx of private equity donations from technology entrepreneurs who had been transfixed by the forensic precision of the case, the group established a permanent, high-velocity digital lab in Denver, tasked with running continuous, automated pattern recognition algorithms across millions of historical missing persons files from the late 20th century. They refused to let the momentum of the Northern Arizona recoveries fade into institutional forgetfulness, systematically purchasing the historical corporate records, land use maps, and fuel ledgers of the suspects' defunct real estate firms before they could be destroyed by bankruptcy courts or shredded by negligent corporate executors, ensuring that every month of the static nomad's double life remained under a continuous, digital microscope. The analytical precision of this citizen-led data network generated a massive, historic breakthrough during the spring of 2026, when their remote-sensing GIS engineers isolated a highly anomalous pattern of property grading and concrete delivery logs from October 1992, a specific, unmapped window during which the suspect's firm was contracted to build a series of deep-water retention basements for a luxury commercial plaza on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The data tracking revealed that while the city of Phoenix was undergoing a historic real estate boom, characterized by rapid, unmonitored infrastructure development and an immense influx of out-of-state labor, the suspect had personally altered the architectural blueprints of the subterranean utility vaults, ordering an immediate, high-volume concrete pour on a Friday evening long after the local building inspectors had left the site for the weekend. This chronological variance acted like a high-voltage current cutting through 34 years of administrative silence, forcing the multi-state task force to rapidly coordinate a massive, subterranean radar sweep of the commercial plaza's foundation as the entire country watched the true, monstrous scope of the old man's double life continue to expand out of the archives. The execution of the forensic sweep inside the active, bustling commercial center of Phoenix was a logistical and psychological nightmare for the local municipal authorities, presenting a stark, high-tension contrast between the vibrant energy of a modern metropolis and the dark, historical horrors lurking beneath its pavement. Heavy excavation machinery, mobile ground-penetrating radar arrays, and specialized structural engineers descended upon the subterranean parking garages of the plaza under a cloud of absolute operational secrecy, working under the glare of temporary industrial floodlights while ordinary shoppers and office workers moved through the spaces above, entirely oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath their feet. The forensic team slowly moved their high-frequency radar arrays over the thick, reinforced industrial concrete floors of the utility vaults, their ears tuned to the digital acoustic returns that mapped the density changes in the earth below, knowing that a single structural miscalculation could trigger a catastrophic shift in the massive foundation columns that supported the multi-story buildings overhead. On the third consecutive night of the intense, claustrophobic operation, the military-grade deep-scanning radar equipment flagged a massive, highly distinct geometric anomaly buried 7 feet beneath the secondary foundation pad of the plaza's main electrical transformer vault, an anomaly that completely disrupted the natural geological stratification of the desert clay. The digital imaging projection revealed the unmistakable outline of an unmapped, reinforced subterranean chamber that had been deliberately integrated into the structural matrix of the foundation block during the initial 1992 pour, an architectural void that did not correspond to any official civil engineering or electrical blueprint in the city's historical planning archives. The forensic team knew instantly that they had uncovered a secondary structural tomb, a highly sophisticated, permanent hiding place designed by the primary killer to exploit the total lack of cross-border administrative surveillance during the peak years of his nomadic violence across the Southwest. The breach of the reinforced concrete pad required a surgical, high-precision engineering intervention, with technicians utilizing diamond-tipped industrial core drills and specialized hydraulic splitting systems to carefully slice through the dense layers of historical stone and steel rebar without generating structural vibrations that could compromise the integrity of the surrounding facility. The air inside the closed utility vault grew thick, hot, and suffocating, filled with the deafening roar of the heavy machinery and the fine, chalky dust of the severed concrete that hung in the air like a heavy white mist under the beam of the forensic floodlights. When the final, massive block of concrete was slowly extracted using a specialized overhead hoist, it revealed the degraded, blackened edges of a commercial-grade fiberglass storage vault that had been wrapped in heavy layers of asphalt-saturated roofing felt, a highly calculated environmental barrier designed to isolate the contents from the intense, baking heat of the Arizona desert soil for generations. As the forensic anthropologists carefully pried open the reinforced seals of the fiberglass vault, their hands steady but their faces pale behind their protective respirators, the structural tomb finally surrendered a collection of historical artifacts that sent an immediate shock of revulsion and profound tragedy through the highest levels of national law enforcement. Inside the vault sat an immaculate, meticulously curated archive of personal items, vintage jewelry, and identification documents belonging to 3 different individuals who had vanished entirely from the Phoenix metropolitan area and Southern California between 1990 and 1993. Individuals whose names had spent over 3 decades relegated to the forgotten cold case files of fragmented local police departments. Alongside the documentation sat a secondary, hidden cache of handwritten logistical maps and behavioral observation logs executed in the killer's distinct, neat penmanship, the actual missing chapters of the historical field journals that had been withheld from the Palm Springs Foot Locker, proving that he viewed his cross-country career of violence as a single, unified corporate masterpiece that he intended to preserve in perpetuity beneath the changing geometry of the New West. The confirmation of the Phoenix victims shattered the final remnants of the public narrative that had attempted to paint the suspect as a regular man who had simply committed a single, desperate crime in his youth before transforming into a model citizen in California. It established his legacy beyond any shadow of a doubt as one of the most prolific, undetected serial predators in modern American history, an individual who had successfully weaponized the rapid infrastructure expansion of the Sun Belt to build an empire of middle-class prosperity directly on top of a hidden network of graves. In New York City, the local media networks broke into regular programming with flashing red banners, the words, "New York 1982 Cold Case Solved, Subterranean Vault Uncovered in Phoenix Ends Decades of Mystery," burning themselves into the consciousness of a public that had long believed the story had reached its final conclusion with the suspect's death. The original anchor of that 1982 headline took on an epic, generational scale, viewed no longer as a lucky break in an isolated investigation, but as the master key that had systematically forced a multi-state reckoning with a ghost that had haunted the nation's conscience for 44 years. The legal and administrative aftermath of the Phoenix discovery moved with an ironclad, rapid precision to ensure that every single asset, property, and corporate trust ever linked to the suspect's historical firms was permanently seized and subjected to total federal liquidation under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, with the proceeds funneled directly into expanding the digital infrastructure of the National Forensic Advocacy Group. The state of Arizona launched a sweeping, comprehensive legislative audit of its historical building and infrastructure records from the late 20th century, utilizing the precise methodology of the suspect's structural entombments to implement strict new deep scanning radar verification standards for all modern commercial construction projects across the state, ensuring that the structural blind spots of the past could never again be weaponized by predators seeking to conceal their crimes. Beneath the growth of the city, the final resting places of the newly identified Phoenix victims were eventually marked by a series of beautiful, matching stone monuments funded entirely by the liquidated assets of the suspect's corporate estate, their emotional dedication ceremonies attended by a massive, interconnected network of surviving family members, retired homicide detectives, and ordinary citizens who had been profoundly moved by the relentless, multi-generational march of the investigation. The monument stood as a permanent, physical declaration that the names, the histories, and the stolen futures of the forgotten had finally been rescued from the crushing silence of the past, shifting their memories out of the realm of unresolved urban legends and into the sacred, dignified sanctuary of eternal peace. The family of the 1982 Greenwich Village victims stood alongside the Arizona families in a powerful show of cross-continental solidarity, their collective tears falling onto the desert earth as they realized that their 44-year journey through the darkness had finally delivered a total, unyielding close to the nightmare that had frozen their hearts for a generation. In the quiet, cool twilight of the Phoenix Plaza, where the heavy mechanical drills had finally gone silent and the structural utility vaults had been permanently backfilled with reinforced commercial grout, a profound, solemn peace settled over the property. The subterranean garage space was completely remodeled by the corporate ownership group, its hidden chambers permanently sealed, and the wall above transformed into a beautiful, native desert reflection sanctuary filled with pale stone paths, low benches, and a single, understated bronze plaque that bore only the names of the individuals whose histories had been reclaimed from the darkness below. The office workers and shoppers who walked past the site in the evening air did so with a renewed sense of reverence and collective memory, understanding that the space had been permanently transformed from a monument of hidden terror into a sanctuary of absolute truth. The story of the static nomad who lived a double life had reached its absolute, definitive completion, its codes decrypted, its structural tombs breached, its hidden field journals laid bare before the world, and its vast cross-country ledger of horror permanently, irrevocably balanced under the wide, open canopy of the changing sky. The city of New York, the suburban enclaves of California, and the empty expanses of the American West could finally sleep in absolute safety, knowing that the longest, darkest night in their shared fugitive history had finally, irrevocably met the absolute dawn, leaving behind an enduring, unassailable legacy of forensic persistence, institutional memory, and the unyielding, patient power of the truth.